Hey guys, this video is for econ class. I'm just going to quickly cover chapter 5. So we already covered chapters 6 through 12 in class. Chapter 5 and then 13 are next. I'll keep this video pretty short. This is a short chapter, and just going to give a little bit of input and review the PowerPoints for you. Again, sorry, this camera's not very clear. I'm just using my laptop from work. And I know things are kind of scattered right now, just trying to figure things out with talking circles and everything else like that. But if you're ever unclear about something, just send me an email, or if something is missing from Moodle or anything like that, just send me an email and try and sort it out like that. And yeah, we're doing the best we can and just kind of scrambling right now to have everything prepared and keep in touch with all the students. So I'll just share the screen here with PowerPoints. Okay. So for macroeconomics, chapter 5, again, it's a short chapter. We're just looking at government's role and government failure when it comes to the economy. So to start out with this chapter, we're mostly just looking at government's power, what they can do to coerce and create economic benefits or economic downfalls, looking at their failures and why that happens. So obviously, like with Canada, we do have that market system where we have a lot of free market aspects to our economy, but we also have a lot of government control, like the command system form of an economy. So starting out here, looking at government's right to coerce, government has the legal right to enforce involuntary transactions. So private companies can't, in a free market system, private companies can't force you to do anything, whereas the government does force transactions, right? It does force you to pay into EI, it does force you to pay into CPP, it does force you to pay taxes, it does force you to pay minimum wage, things like that. And if you don't comply, then there are punishments, whether that's fines or imprisonment or whatever, depending on the country and depending on the rules you break. That force can increase economic efficiency. By forcing you to pay taxes, they can take that money and spend it on things to help the economy in some cases. Can correct for market failures, things like positive externalities and negative externalities, which we've covered already. I believe we covered those in microeconomics, so you should be familiar with those a little bit. You know, negative externalities would be like just pollution being caused by a private company, you know, producing whatever it is, oil or something like that. And then the positive externalities, that was like the example we talked about with putting on like a fireworks show. There are positive externalities to that. The last thing there is reducing private sector economic risks. So, you know, if the private sector in Saskatchewan were to take over vehicle insurance or utilities like electrical, water, things like that, it could be a big risk for them to take on. And if it failed, then it'd be kind of a disaster. So in instances like that, the government can step in and take over providing those services where there's lower risks, because you know, even if they fail, they can revise, and the government's not going to go out of business like a private sector company would. The problem of managing and directing government, there's no invisible hand. You'll remember we talked about invisible hand before, kind of just meaning that in order for a company to succeed, they need to offer value to other people. You can't have a successful business unless you're giving consumers what they want. Whereas with the government, they don't have to abide by that. There is no invisible hand with government. They don't have to serve the public's best interests in order to stay in control. Massive size and scope, so depending on the country or region or whatever, but in Canada we do have a very large country in terms of geography, and government is involved in a lot of different areas, so that can be tough to manage. Need for bureaucracy, the more government we have, the more rules, regulations, restrictions, things like that, so things get really complicated. Even like if you guys are doing your taxes lately, like there's a lot of different tax rules, codes, regulations, paperwork, things like that. The need for paperwork and inflexibility. Yeah, it's just, you know, with with governance, there tends to be a lot of that stuff. It's not so free-flowing and easy to adapt like with smaller businesses. Even like, for example, when you have a really small business where you just have one location, it's very easy to be flexible. But as soon as you have a franchise where you have maybe 50 locations throughout the country, it's a little bit more difficult to be flexible. So just imagine the government having all these areas and all these towns, cities, provinces all over the country. It makes it harder to be flexible. The information aggregation problem, just having kind of too much information, making it difficult to share proper information with higher up government officials to make decisions, things like that. And then lack of accountability. Like the government, you know, just like with corporations, people running the corporations can kind of hide behind the entity of the corporation, just like in government, government officials can kind of hide behind that government, whatever you want to call it. Like, you know, it's not so personal. Next thing here, government failure. So things like the principal and agent problem, that's where, like, you know, the agent is the one acting. So a real estate agent or a sports agent, they're acting, they're representing the principal, which could be the athlete who's looking to sign with a team, or the home buyer or the home seller. But this principal agent problem occurs when that agent ends up kind of focusing on serving themselves, looking out for their best interest rather than the principal, the person that they're supposed to be serving. So maybe that sports athlete is you know, looking for a team for their client that's going to pay the most to the agent rather than pay the most to the athlete, or the real estate agents is pressuring their client to buy a really expensive house because they're going to get more commission from it. So you end up with that problem sometimes where the agent is trying to serve their best interest rather than the principal. So the same thing can happen with government, where government is doing things to serve their best interest and not actually doing what's best for the public or society. Government failure refers to inefficient outcomes caused by shortcomings in the public sector. So government failure just meaning when, you know, government is intervening, taking control of certain sectors and creating shortcomings, not doing things as efficiently as possible. Incentive structures facing government, so lead them either to put their own interests ahead of voter interests or put interests of majority of voters ahead of those minority of voters ahead of those of majority voters. So obviously sometimes government officials do things in their own interests. You've probably heard of stories before where they're, you know, spending a lot of money on travel or vacations or something like that. And that's not in the best interest of the voters, or putting the interest of minority voters ahead of those of majority voters. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that are happening with government that are sometimes corrupt, maybe not even corrupt, but just failures in the sense that it's not the best choice. There are shortcomings, it's inefficient. Principal agent problem, so we discussed that. Special interest effect. So that's when a small group obtains large gains at the expense of a much larger group who individually suffer small losses. So you've probably heard of the term small interest groups before, like lobbyists. You know, sometimes an industry, maybe like the dairy industry or something, will have lobbyists that are trying to influence government and putting pressure on the government, even though it's a small group of people. They're trying to influence laws, regulations, government behavior for their best interest, which may not be in the best interest of a much larger group. So we do have that problem. Even I think that's kind of what happened with taxis, where, you know, you had like a lot of government relation with the taxi companies or whatever, and that's in part what took Uber so long to get going in Saskatchewan. Next thing, rent-seeking behavior. So any payment in excess of the minimum needed to keep a resource employed in its current source. So rent-seeking behavior, kind of just like, you know, seeking financial benefit from the government, like getting free rent, you know. Oops. Wrong one here. Okay, there we go. Rent-seeking behavior, yeah. Bureaucracy and inefficiency, talked about that a little bit already. I would say for sure for this chapter, browse your textbook. It's pretty short. There's a little more information on this, and I don't want to make this video too long. Inefficient regulation intervention, so regulatory capture. That's kind of when the government's trying to regulate a certain industry, but they end up, having people who are working for the government in regulation in that regulatory position that maybe have worked in that industry before, and so they end up kind of just not regulating from an objective standpoint. Government's poor investment track record, loan guarantees, socializing losses, privatizing gains. Yeah, there's a lot there. I'll keep going though. Government failure, misdirection of stabilization policy, so fiscal policy. That when we talk about fiscal policy, we're talking from the perspective of government. In a private market, you don't have fiscal policy, but that attempts to use changes in tax rates and spending levels to offset the business cycle. And then the monetary policy attempts to use changes in interest rates to regulate the economy. So this is stuff that's pretty big for macroeconomics and things that are happening right now. We've seen interest rates fall recently in response to what's going on, so that's monetary policy. And then fiscal policy, we're seeing that right now in Canada as well. Having to do with unemployment that's happening right now, so they're stimulating their buyouts and whatever these emergency payouts to people. So that's the government intervening and imposing fiscal policy and monetary policy. A central bank's in charge of the monetary policy. So we do have a central bank in Canada, and they're the ones that are determining interest rates. Same thing in the US. Some more with government failures, corruption. Of course, there's most definitely corruption in government, and some governments are good at hiding it. Others, it's more obvious, depending on the country and stuff. Political corruption is the unlawful misdirection of government resources or actions for personal gain. So that could even be on an individual level, like I've mentioned, with politicians maybe using tax money for their own personal reasons. Two of the basic forms of corruption would be government officials being bribed to do part of his job. So that could be getting bribed from individuals, could be from other governments, could be from companies, maybe bribing officials to help them out. And then the other one, government official demands a bribe to do something illegal. So when you're in a position of power like that, you could force companies or individuals to pay you, to bribe you in order to get some assistance. And I'm sure that happens a lot in Canada, but maybe a lot more in other countries, like wherever in the Philippines or something. I feel like there's a little more bribery going on there, or even in Mexico. Just a chart from your textbook, percentage of households paying a bribe in the past year. This was a survey taken in 2013. I mean, this would be really tough to get accurate information on. I don't know how many households they went to and how many people are going to be honest, but here, Sierra Leone in Africa, saying that over 80% of households paid a bribe in that past year from 2013 or whatever to, I guess, government officials. So very high. I guess there's probably a lot of corruption in Sierra Leone and some of these other African countries. India, Mexico is a little bit higher compared to the United States. What is that, like less than 10%? Hard to measure, but kind of interesting to look at. Last little bit of this chapter, imperfect institutions with government failures. Markets and government are both imperfect. Criticisms of public sector inefficiency. Difficult to assign a good service to either the public sector or private sector. Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect system really. Sometimes government stepping in can be useful. Sometimes they end up causing more harm than good. Really depends on the situation. I'm definitely more into a free market system, as I've said before, but I get that there are shortcomings with that too. Last part from this chapter is just that last word, and it's looking at Singapore, which Singapore's come up before in class. They have a pretty unique system there. Singapore ranks at the top for quality of its healthcare system, has the world's lowest rate of infant mortality, and the world's 4th highest life expectancy, which is pretty impressive. Spends less per person on healthcare than any other developed nation. So they're putting in less, but they're getting out more in terms of health, if you're measuring it in terms of infant mortality and life expectancy. Their healthcare system encourages competition, which I think is really important, actually. And, you know, with most industries, we want competition because that forces companies to, you know, offer better services, offer better prices, things like that. We don't really have competition with our healthcare system. High out-of-pocket costs for consumers, which sounds like a bad thing, and in a sense it is. We don't want to have to pay a lot for healthcare, but in a way, I guess that incentivizes society, the members of society, to avoid running into health problems. If they're going to have high costs, you know, it incentivizes them to take care of themselves. Laws requiring people to save for future health expenditures. So maybe like in Canada, how we have CPP or EI forcing us to prepare for our retirement, I guess they have laws that require people to save for a health account, which would be really beneficial. But yeah, that's it for this chapter. So sorry, I kind of rushed through that. I don't want to make these videos too long, but read through the textbook on that chapter. I've read through it, and it's, you know, breaks down things pretty well. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions for chapter 5 or anything else.